In this next step, we're going to integrate the first Symfony component that we're going to use. Let's do it first and see it in action, and then we'll explain why it makes sense to do it this way. In order to pull this component into our project, we're going to use Composer. So go to your resource pack directory and copy this third step called composer.json, adding Http Foundation component. Go ahead and copy it and paste it inside of your example folder for Symfony. And we'll rename this file composer.json. Now, in order to run this, we're going to go to the command line and make sure we're in this folder. So I'm going to grab this Symfony folder, jump over to my terminal screen, type cd space, and then drop it in and hit enter. So this pulls me to the right folder. Now, just like in our previous examples where we worked with Composer, we're going to type composer.var. If you're on Windows, it will be just Composer, and install. It might take just a minute to download everything. Okay, this looks good. So now let's alter our script to use the HTTP Foundation, which is what we just downloaded from the Symfony project. So back in the resource pack directory, let's open up the fourth step called index.php using request and response instead of globals. We'll copy this code and paste it over the code in our index.php file and save it. Now if we go back to the browser and refresh, we should see no difference in behavior. If we remove the name parameter from the query string and hit enter, we'll see hello world. And so functionally our script hasn't changed at all. Now let's go back and look at what we just did. If we go to our folder where our example is, and we open up our composer.json file, you'll see that we're pulling in a single Symfony component called HTTP Foundation. And we can take a look at the code by jumping to our vendor folder and expanding it and taking a look at what we downloaded through Composer. I'm going to scroll down a bit. So it looks like we actually got a lot with this download. The two things that we're going to use initially though are request here, and if we scroll down a little bit more, response here. You can even open these up in your editor to take a look at them. They have a lot of good comments explaining what each aspect of the component is supposed to do. And if you get curious about how a particular parameter works or a particular method, you can always go into these classes and take a look at them directly. So now let's look at our code and see what's different here. So just like we do with any composer-driven project, we're going to include the autoload file inside of the vendor folder. This will allow us to use autoloading on any class that gets included via Composer. We're going to use the Symfony component HTTP Foundation request and response as well. So again, use will allow us to access these classes without using the fully qualified name. In our first line of actual code, we use a static method called createFromGlobals inside of the request class and set that as the request variable. We're going to set our input variable just like we did before, but instead of using the get variables directly, we're going to use a method inside of the request class called get. This will allow us to access any of those get variables without having to use the global get variable. The first parameter that we pass is the key, and the second value we pass is the default value. So if we compare this with our previous code, I'm going to go back to the resource pack directory, and I'm going to select the last two versions of our index.php file to compare them. I'm going to drag them over to this program called Kaleidoscope, but you can use any program to compare these. I'm going to make sure that the older one is on the left, and you can see the difference here. So in our initial code, we used a ternary operator to check to see if the variable was set. If it was, we're going to use it. If not, we're going to set a default. The new code is a little bit more concise and a bit easier to read. Ternary operators are always a little bit confusing to wrap your head around. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the code in our editor. And in this next line, we craft a response. And you can see our code in here looks really familiar. It's identical to our code from before, but instead of printing it, we're wrapping it inside of this response object. So we're creating a new instance of the response class and setting that to the response variable. And finally, to print out our output, we're using response send.